Hello, my fellow enthusiasts, and welcome to Day 5 of TCotC Week. Today we're going to be talking about the protagonists of TCotC. Now, obviously, there's what I like to call the Flagship 4 that you all know and love, but we're also going to discuss 3 other Mortal Realm protagonists, and obviously, there's the deities aspect in the understory with Pamu, but if I went and discussed every single deity in the Pantheon, this would be a pretty redundant and kind of boring video. So we're just going to stick to the Mortal Realm protagonists and Pamu for now, because you guys are pretty familiar with all the Duat deities already. So, without further ado, here goes. The first main character, and the character on the first cover of TCotC, is, obviously, Solaris. Solaris' full name, I guess you could say, is Solaris Arazel, but his last name is completely made up. He made it up on the spot because he was not born with a last name. The Egyptians didn't really have things like last names. They had, it's kind of like they would know where they were from, so Solaris would be safe. If he was from a certain city, he'd be Solaris of this city. He wouldn't really have a last name, and it's that sort of thing that eventually gets turned into last names in, European culture. A lot of people's last names come from, their professions and things like that. So, in ancient Egypt, they didn't really have a concept of anything like that, so upon getting reawakened in the modern day, Solaris finds himself in need of a last name, and so he literally just makes it up on the spot with help from some little kids, because Ace had quite a few kids, because, he adopted many children, and those kids and Solaris worked together to create a last name. So it sounds silly for a reason, because it was made by kids. Solaris is an Egyptian tessem, and a tessem is an ancient Egyptian hunting dog. The real world, it was a real thing, but the modern world equivalent, I guess you could say, if you're looking for something to compare Solaris to, it would be a Canaan dog. They come in the same kind of colors that Solaris did in life, and if you look hard enough, you can actually find a Canaan dog that looks almost exactly like Solaris did. Except for the fact that, it's a feral dog and not an anthropomorphic animal sapient. Solaris comes from a family of 5, so he's got his 2 parents, 2 little siblings, and then himself as the eldest child. His siblings, he had a little sister, but I never actually just gave her a name because she's not important. But his little brother is important because his relationship with his little brother is how he came to get involved with Ace's kids, because he kind of worked as an older brother figure to Ace's kids when he was living with them. And so his little brother might be mentioned across the story, so I went through the trouble of giving him a design and a name. So his name was Thalassa. Thalassa means relating to the sea, whereas Solaris obviously relates to the sun. Solaris gets his name from the little white mark on his forehead because it looks like a star. But his name doesn't sound very Egyptian, does it? That's because he and his family are actually from Greek descendants, I guess you could say. Or Greek ancestry. There we go, that's the word I'm looking for. And so they lived in Egypt for many generations, but they are originally from Greek ancestry. So that's just why he's got kind of a sort of weird name and things like that. Interbreeding with the Egyptian population has obviously caused, him to resemble more Egyptian dogs, since the Canaan dog is from around the Middle Eastern area, so it makes sense why he would look like that, but on his mother's side, he comes from Greek ancestry. Solaris, as you guys probably know already, he is basically the main face of TCotC, and he used to be a Magi under Pharaoh Pamu. The Magi is basically like a bodyguard for the Pharaoh. They can also serve as policemen for the city the Pharaoh was in and things like that. And there's actually this cool instance. Some of them had police animals, but it's not police dogs. They had things like police baboons. And I don't think Solaris would be the kind of guy to have a police baboon, but oh man, he would struggle immensely if he had to control one of those things, because baboons are pretty scary. And Solaris is Solaris is hilariously oblivious. He is completely from his time. He doesn't know how to adapt to the modern world very well, so he tends to be very oblivious and not really understand a whole lot of what's going on around him. But back in the ancient world, when he was still a Magi, he was actually very on top of things. He knew what he was doing. He was very good at fighting with a sword and a bow. And he was also pretty popular among the ladies and things like that. But you look at him now, and he's just this eccentric goofball. And so his heyday was back in the ancient world. So he misses it a whole lot, and he obviously misses his family. But he's gotten to the point where he's sort of settled into the modern age, but he doesn't really fit in that well. So, you guys already know Solaris' whole backstory from reading Chapter 1 of the comic, because he basically narrates all of Chapter 1 and tells you about himself and things like that. So, that's Solaris, and the next flagship protagonist is Kenny. Kenny is short for Kenichi because his family came from Asia before he was adopted by Ace. And so his name is a hyphenated name because he keeps his family name, but he also takes on his adoptive father's name. So that's just something, that you can see on his ref. It's not quite the same as Ace's. That's because the first part of his hyphenated name is his old name from his birth parents. His parents actually passed away at some point, so they didn't give him up out of necessity. They gave him up because of some sort of accident or other. I never really came up with an actual reason why that was. It was just, he was adopted by Ace, and that's really all he ever knew. He was adopted around 2 or 3 years old, so Ace is really just the parent he always knew. And he was the second youngest of all of Ace's kids, and now he's the only one who's not, fully dead, because, he's a ghost. But I wouldn't call that, fully dead, because that means he's still kind of in the mortal realm, but he's also kind of not, so I don't know. He's not fully dead, is my point. Poor little Kenny died when he was 11 years old, but for some reason, after turning into a ghost, he kept aging. And that will be explained in the comic. Hint, hint, he's actually not completely dead, like I was saying. Obviously a ghost isn't a fully dead thing, I guess you could say, because it's kind of like a soul, but Kenny isn't even a full ghost. He's actually got some part of him still alive in the world somewhere. And that will be explained later, and I'm going to avoid spoiling it however possible. He sort of, I guess you could say, quote, haunts Station NA1, because it's right beneath the city he lived in when he was still fully alive. And Solaris, obviously, is kind of like a familial friend to him, so he knows Solaris and Ace. And so Kenny has a tendency to follow Solaris around because, he knew him in life. And so the reason he doesn't really follow his father as much is because, don't get me wrong, he adores Ace. He idolizes the heck out of Ace. But Ace has kind of gotten his shit together, I guess you could say. And I just got through explaining that Solaris really doesn't fit in. And so Kenny kind of just follows Solaris around because Solaris is usually alone, and that lets him, actually pretend like he's talking to Solaris, unfortunately. Poor Kenny is very, very lonely. And I explained in the Q&A video, he can interact with several objects, but people are unable to see him, unless it's through, a reflective surface. So Solaris, I also mentioned this in the Q&A video, the first time Solaris and Kenny, actually fully interact is when Solaris sees Kenny in a mirror. Up until that point, Kenny is just kind of pantomiming in the background, and so Solaris will be doing his thing, and then you'll just see kind of Kenny floating there and emoting in the background, and then we finally see Solaris notice Kenny, because in the comic, Kenny is kind of this white, transparent figure to communicate that he's a ghost, but to Solaris, he's actually going to see Kenny as he was in life in the mirror. And so that makes it all the it's more surprising, I guess you could say, and probably a little scarier initially, but Kenny doesn't mean any harm, obviously. He's a harmless little boy. Kenny actually used to be my favorite character, and he still holds a very special place in my heart. He was the first character I created out of the cast, and he underwent the most changes. I gotta say, I adore him. He's a wonderful little cinnamon roll. And he looks pretty young, but he's actually in his early 20s. This is really just because he never really had the chance to grow up, so you'll see him acting like somewhat childish and clinging to childish idealism and things like that. It's because he really never had the chance to grow up, like for real, and so he's just been a ghost for most of his development, and he hasn't really had to deal with a whole lot of stuff. He has seen death, he understands that sort of thing, obviously, because, you know, the Infernals are a thing, and he can see everything that's happened. But for the most part, he's just a happy-go-lucky little guy who really just wants a friend. Alright, so the third flagship protagonist that is a favorite of Anna's is Ace. Ace is the Director of Operations of the Global Defense Force at Station NA1. As explained in the lore video, he used to be he was a retired police officer, and he had settled down to take care of his kids because he felt like he'd made enough money and things like that so they could all live comfortably. Unfortunately for him, six. Okay, I'm sorry. I always lose track because I have all the designs and the names of the kids, but I always, for some reason, end up including Ace in the number, and Ace can't be his own kid, so I always whiffle between 6 and 7 because, you know, I used to have, like, these things burned in my head, but now they're just kind of a secondary thing that I don't really think about. But yeah, he had 6 kids. Kenny was the second youngest, and so they all passed away in the first, you know, wave, I guess you could say, of the Infernal outbreak, and it completely crushed Ace. His kids were everything to him. He is a monster that, like, was disguising himself so he could be in sapient society, but he wasn't really doing anything shady. He was trying to live life to the fullest and trying to embrace a new life. So he wasn't, like, up to anything. He was just trying to live, and he adopted these kids because he really wanted a family, and they became his family. He loved them with all his heart. One thing I notice a lot is people give adoption a whole bad rap, but to me it seems like the blood bond doesn't mean anywhere near as much as the bond, like, that you cultivate between, you know, the parental figure and the children. And so with that, I just wanted to demonstrate that, you know, the whole adoption thing, kids can have happy lives as adopted kids and things like that. And, you know, I can't speak for every case of adoption, but for some reason in mass media, adoption just gets this really bad rap. And so, like, in movies, you'll see kids go off and ditch their adopted parents to go find their birth parents and things like that. That's part of the reason that I made Kenny's actual birth parents deceased, because there's no suggestion there that he go ditch Ace and go find his real parents. You know, Ace is his father, and he couldn't want for anything more. I think Ace is awesome. Anna, my best friend, she loves to go crazy about Ace. He is her favorite character. She could probably tell you more about him than I could, because she's been around for 6 of the 8 years of TCotC's development, so she's heard every little detail I've sprinkled into there. But yes, as a monster, he is unable to reproduce with sapience. That's why he ended up adopting his kids. Yeah, he was an all-around great dad, and he just kind of became cynical and closed down a whole lot emotionally after they died, because they were everything to him. And so he returned to, like, his police officer background when the infernal outbreak started, so he was, like, rounding up people and trying to protect them, as infernals were, like, infesting the city, and his role in evacuating people and things like that is what earned him a spot in the GDF, as, you know, the station was forming, and his supernatural powers combined with his know-how of the area and things like that quickly skyrocketed him through the ranks, and that earned him his place as director. Now, as director, Ace is really just no-nonsense, straight to the point. In Chapter 1, it is communicated through Solaris' point of view that Ace hates Solaris and blames him for surviving when his kids didn't. But that could not be anywhere further from the truth, as we are going to see in Chapter 3 when we return to the overworld. Ace actually does care a whole lot about Solaris. He sort of views Solaris as a pseudo-son, not quite a son, but, you know, it's the closest thing he's got to his kids anymore, and Solaris was a big friend of the family and things like that, so Ace wants to protect Solaris, and that's part of the reason he's so hard on him. It's because he doesn't want Solaris to become part of the GDF, because he's afraid Solaris is going to get himself killed. Unfortunately, the GDF style of using its soldiers is essentially throwing people at the Infernals until they go away. Because there's just really nothing you can do when you have such an understaffed, underfunded army right there, and you don't really have the adequate means to take these guys out. So, like I mentioned in the lore video, the soldiers of the GDF kind of have to supply themselves when it comes to things like armor and whatnot. So, essentially, getting promoted to, like, a GDF officer is you kind of have a high death rate. You shouldn't, like, expect to survive very long, unfortunately. So even though Sora and Solaris are, like, really eager to help and be GDF officers, Ace is kind of just looking at all these officers and is like, these kids are going to get themselves killed. And so that's part of the reason Ace is trying to bar Solaris from becoming an officer, is because he doesn't want him to get himself killed. So yeah, that's Ace's character at this point in the comic. And that leaves my personal favorite character, Pamu. Pamu comes from a royal family. Obviously, he was pharaoh back in the ancient world. He's actually pretty well educated. He wouldn't be familiar with a whole lot of modern mortal realm, I guess you could say, stuff, because, you know, obviously there's a 3,000 year gap between when he died and the modern age. But he can write in Coptic, Coptic, hieratic, and hieroglyphics, so he knows 3 written languages, and he can obviously speak in one language, but he can write in those languages, and I bet he could, if he tried hard enough, he could try and speak in a different language. He got the best the ancient world could offer in terms of education, so he's pretty well off in that sense, but there's still a huge gap in between his knowledge and the knowledge of the modern world. And obviously he has no idea about the Infernals and things like that, so he wouldn't really fare too well if he was just plopped out of the Duat and into the mortal realm. Pamu is the only mortal protagonist of the understory of TCotC, because he's really the only mortal left in Duat. All the other protagonists in the understory are the gods themselves, aside from Set, who is the antagonist. But, yeah, so Pamu is really the only one in the understory that's going to get covered today, and so I'm going to kind of cover parts of the understory in his little profile, I guess you could say. Pamu's mom, Aset Hotep, was absolutely freaking insane. I can't stress that enough. Aset Hotep was a witch in all meanings of the word. I know I've said that before, but it's true. She was mean, she was bona fide evil, and used all sorts of dark powers and schemes to basically cement her role as ruler in Egypt. I'll cover her more in the villains video, because she's going to be a villain in the comic at some point. But yeah, essentially she ends up killing her own husband too. So that leaves her and her son Pamu as like the 2 main controllers of of the Egyptian Empire at the time, and so Pamu's entire development from when he was very young was dependent on his mother, and so there was a lot of emotional abuse there between the two of them. And his mom was always trying to manipulate him to do all sorts of things. And she really, really wanted him to be like this ruthless, powerful ruler. But Pamu is Pamu. He's very scrawny, unfortunately for him, as a result of his inbred line. He can barely lift his sword. He's not very physically strong, and he's kind of a shrimp. He's the second shortest out of the cast. The only person out of the flagship 4 who's shorter than him is Kenny, and Kenny is, he's kind of just a little kid, and so Pamu, he's really not got the makeup of a would-be tyrant, and so he's kind of just all of a disappointment. all of everything disappointing to his mother wrapped up into a tight little scared ball. And so a lot of Pamu's early years, he was paranoid and things like that. He learned a lot of what he does know from his wet nurse. Wet nurses would obviously take over the role of mothering for the queens and things like that. So the wet nurse, Yosefet, was really his actual mother figure, whereas Asetotep was more just like this distant but very domineering figure in his life. So she was there, but his actual parental figure was Yosefet, who acted as like a secondary mother to him. And so Yosefet taught little Pamu morals and things like that, and she told him stories of the gods and about Egypt's history and things like that. And so Yosefet played a big part in shaping Pamu into a good person, and essentially made it very hard for Asetotep to mold him into what she wanted. Another thing is that Pamu is the only fully gay member of the cast. Kenny is bisexual, Solaris is heterosexual, and Ace is asexual, funnily enough. That was not intentional, the lineup of the name and the sexuality, but yeah, Pamu is homosexual, and a big part in his foundation of the story, and his story, is that he was in love with Solaris in life. I tried to illustrate that through their short interaction in the beginning of chapter 1 with the whole dream sequence and everything like that. After Pamu becomes pharaoh after his mother passes away, that'll be explained in the comic. Don't worry. But after his mom dies, and he becomes the only ruler of Egypt, Solaris is kind of the only person he can talk to, and things like that. And he really just kind of crushes head over heels for Solaris, which probably isn't healthy. But he can't really help it, and so that plays an enormous part in the foundation of the story for TCotC. Part of what actually happens to make Solaris and Pamu undead relies on the fact that Pamu is so in love with Solaris. So I won't explain that plotline to its fullest, but Pamu ends up throughout his story using his resolve to reunite with Solaris as a driving force to make him finish his tasks and things like that. So he helps restore the Duat, and in the back of his mind, he's like, if I can do this, if I can save Duat, maybe I'll be able to find Solaris' shade among the people who return to Duat. So like I mentioned in the lore video, when a Chaos Spawn or Infernal eats like a shade instead of killing a person, the shade is not destroyed, the shade being the soul. The shade is not destroyed, and so if you kill the Chaos Spawn that ate them, the shade is released. And so Pamu is convinced that Solaris is somewhere in the Duat, because obviously they died. And so he convinces himself, okay, I can help save the gods, and maybe, just maybe, I'll find Solaris along the way. And so that's a big driving force throughout the understory. And unfortunately for Pamu, Solaris is not in Duat. He is in the overworld. And Pamu doesn't learn that until almost the very end of the comic, and it completely destroys him because he thinks that means that Solaris is gone forever and things like that. So yeah, that's the flagship 4, and we still have 3 more Mortal Realm protagonists to go over. The first is Sora. Sora, obviously, is a rabbit, and he is one of Solaris's friends. They aren't particularly close friends, but Sora is really the only friend that Solaris develops when he settles into Station 81. Sora was once a mechanic when the world was like fully functioning and before the Infernal Outbreak happened. He was a mechanic, car mechanic actually, so he's, like I mentioned in the lore video, he's one of the few people who owns a car anymore. He brought down his truck into Station 81, and there's really no use for it, but he can use it on trips out of the station, and it makes things a lot easier for him getting around the wasteland. And that helps him to collect parts and things like that, because he's got the bed of a pickup truck and things like that. Yeah, that's really what he uses that for. A lot of cars, like I mentioned earlier in the Q&A video, don't exist anymore. They're kind of just burnt husks because cars will blow up when exposed to fire because of all the gasoline in their tanks and things like that. So Sora has to be really careful when he takes his pickup truck anywhere, but usually he's able to outmaneuver Infernals. There are a couple scorch marks on the very back of his truck, so that wasn't a very pleasant experience for him, I guess you could say. Sora's main thing is his speed. As a rabbit, he's really naturally fast and things like that, so his whole thing of being able to combat Infernals is that he'll be able to get in quickly and get out before they're able to grab hold of him and then burn him to death. So that's really how Sora sort of shines, I guess you could say. And unlike Solaris, Sora will actually make it to be a full GDF officer. And the reason he's not one of the flagship 4 is because he plays a significantly less important role on the story than the big 4 do, but he's there, and he will survive to the end of the story. He's going to be a very solid ally for Solaris. I just don't consider him to be as important as the main 4 protagonists. But yeah, he's there. He's going to survive. He's Solaris's friend who becomes a much closer friend, and they work off of each other to help, survive in the wasteland. The the lesser protagonist is Yakari, the drill sergeant we saw in Chapter 1. He's actually a friend of Solaris as well, but he's a much higher ranking officer, obviously, and as a drill sergeant, he's not really allowed to, interact with his lower level friends as much, so he gives them a little bit of hell and teases them a lot, but he is friends with them and things like that. He just can't interact with them very much because he's such a higher level officer. Yakari, like I mentioned in the Q&A, I really don't know what he is, but he does have the ability to fly, and that's really what has saved him basically throughout the Infernal Outbreak. He's able to fly, and that means he can escape the Infernals and things like that. So surviving in the crisis is really dependent on how you can maneuver your way through a battlefield. If you can outmaneuver an Infernal, you're going to be okay, but the second they grab you, it's over. Because once they grab a hold of you, you're going to start burning because of their overflowing mana reserves. So when I mentioned Sora's speed and Yakari being able to fly, those are really the only things keeping them alive. And so they're really, really important to those characters' survival. Yakari, I like to think, speaks in a very exaggerated accent, just because that's how I dreamt him up when I was much younger. He's a big oddball, but he loves showing off for the director, who is Ace at this point. So he wants to be tough and show that he's capable to the director. Not only in hopes of getting a promotion, but also because he really just wants to be noticed by Ace, because everybody thinks of Ace as kind of like a war hero at this point because of how much he's done and how well known he is across the colony, but Ace is just so, like, dead set and focused on his goal that he doesn't really, like, pay attention to anybody outside of his work. And so that's why it's a big thing for Yukari to try and catch the director's eye. So that's why in chapter 1, when Solaris is annoyed with Yukari, we hear him thinking, "Oh, you asshole, you just want to sound good in front of the director," and things like that, because it's a big deal to Yukari. He wants to have that praise. And the third and final protagonist of the Mortal Realm actually has not appeared yet. It is the only female in the protagonist group, and her name is Fantasia. She is a white fox, and I haven't drawn her a whole lot because her design is pretty set in stone, but she hasn't been important in the story up until this point, and she hasn't really been revealed as a character. But Fantasia is pretty important in the story. She is a medic in Station NA1, and eventually joins Solaris and Sora in the Wasteland later in the Overstory. And so she's not important now, but she will be later. And she is also the sister of Lune, who was the fox that was mentioned in chapter 1. Lune was on the wanted poster. He was the guy who was responsible for, like, blowing up a factory. He's not quite an antagonist, I would say. He's more of like an anti-villain who becomes like an anti-hero later on in the story. Like, he flip-flops a whole lot. He's originally on like the opposite side of Solaris and everybody, but eventually he, like, joins with them and things like that. And so Fantasia was his sister. And so once Fantasia appears in the story, we're gonna see mention of Lune a whole lot more, and we're actually going to get, like, his development and things like that. I believe both she and Lune will appear either at the end of chapter 3 or throughout chapter 5. I'm not sure when this stuff is going to take place. The story is set in stone, don't worry, I'm not, like, making it up as I go or anything, but my problem is planning out when these things are going to happen. Okay, that came out wrong. My problem is, like, organizing the comic pages, because I have the story in my head. I know everything that happens, obviously, but it's planning out the pages, and then however many pages I want to be in a chapter, and where I want to, like, cut off and transition to the next chapter. That's why I'm not entirely sure where Fantasia's first appearance will be, and why I haven't drawn her so much, because she's not in the story yet, I don't want to reveal her as much, but, you know, that's why this video exists. And so Fantasia is the last of the protagonists I'm going to be talking about today, because she's really the last major protagonist, I guess you could say. Obviously, the entire world is a protagonist when you think about it, so she's really the last of the protagonists that matters, in a weird way. So there you go. That's the protagonist video for TCotC. I hope you guys learned something. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And I will be drawing a lot of these guys, mostly for practice, and obviously in their appearances in the comic, when I get into college and I start checking out comic pages again. So, without further ado, I hope you guys enjoyed, and have a great night.